Hi, my name is Ginny, also known as Two-Thirds Lotus, and this clip is part of my series analyzing the Essential Bukowski, edited by Abel DeBrito. Nothing has been edited out, so you're seeing this exactly as it was streamed on Twitch, with all the imperfections and tangents of a live stream. If you want to learn more or catch me live, make sure to check out the description, otherwise enjoy the incredible work of Charles Bukowski. We're reading The Swan by Charles Bukowski, apparently. And I have lots of colored markers to use. It is a Bukowski kind of week. Yeah, I do think the same. Oh no, the cap wasn't all the way on this pen. And now it is dried out. Truly tragic. More Bukowski? So here's the thing. I have this little book of like 50 Bukowski poems called the Essential Bukowski here. And until I am through the whole thing, throughout many streams, we will be doing that. Okay, we're going through them all. Yes, but more Bukowski today at the beginning of today's stream. Because, as Stylish Phil said, it is a Bukowski kind of week. And we love our boy here. So this is The Swan. Okay. And I'm going to jump right into it, because maybe if I do this one quick and it's easy, unlikely, but you never know. We might get to like 2 poets of Twitch after that, at very least 1. I'll likely be more of a lurker today. My client is being nervous, a nervous wart today. Absolutely. Thank you. I do appreciate always the lurks, the support, Brian. Thanks for being here. The Swan by Big Charles, the Bukowski. Swans die in the spring too, and there it floated, dead on a Sunday, sideways, circling in current. And I walked to the rotunda and overheard and overhead gods in chariots, dogs, women circled, and death ran down my throat like a mouse. And I heard the people coming with their picnic bags and laughter, and I felt guilty for the swan, as if death were a thing of shame. And like a fool, I walked away and left them, my beautiful swan. The Swan by Charles Bukowski. He writes about birds a lot. I think we've read a few Bukowski bird poems, and we're yet to read Bluebird, and we're yet to read The Mockingbird. I don't know, maybe we read, I don't know. But there are quite a few. His most famous work is called Bluebird. And birds are great. I like them a lot. We read The Sparrow, or As the Sparrow. Death and birds. Swans die in the spring too, and there it floated dead on a Sunday, sideways, circling in the current, and I walked to the rotunda and overheard gods in chariot. No, overhead, not overheard. And I walked to the rotunda, and overhead gods in chariots, dogs, women, circled, and death ran down my throat like a mouse. And I heard the people coming with their picnic bags and laughter, and I felt guilty for the swan, as if death were a thing of shame. And like a fool, I walked away and left them my beautiful swan. I'm gonna put this more in the middle here. It's a beautiful poem, I do think. And we are going to pull it apart a little bit. I actually have no idea what I'm going to talk about yet. We can underline things. It's always a start. Yay, pull it apart. Yes. Twitch is telling me I have an ad starting in 5 minutes, which seems nonsensical because they're supposed to run every 40 minutes. So give me like just 1 second. Ads. 2-minute ad every 40 minutes. Dude, I don't know. That's strange. So, I'm always fascinated where poets decided to drop lines, like where we hit the enter key to make the new line. I know why I do it, so it just fascinates me. Brian Liu, what makes you hit the enter key? What makes you decide that a line has ended here vertically and you move on to the next one? Because I have my own process to it. Emphasis is what you do? Okay. Yeah, Bukowski seems very good at using that, deciding when to hit the enter key. So maybe we can look at some of those things. And to try to dictate pacing a little. Interesting. Push back this ad. Swans die in the spring too. And there it floated, dead on a Sunday, sideways, circling in current. And I walked to the rotunda, and overhead, gods in chariots, dogs, women, circled, and death ran down my throat like a mouse. And I heard people coming with their picnic bags and laughter, and I felt guilty for the swan, as if death were a thing of shame. And like a fool, I walked away and left them my beautiful swan. Make things stand out, but as you've seen, my lines will be long or short even within the same poem. Sometimes single words. Yeah, absolutely. And mine vary. I'm not sure. I think it depends on how I feel during the poem. Sometimes I make patterns. Sometimes it just what feels right. I don't know. I'm really actually quite bad. I like being intentional in my writing, despite how much I say that people are and how much I assume that people are intentional with the things they do. I'm like, yeah, it's time for a new line. Let's hit enter. Feels right. So Well, I imagine Bukowski had a typewriter, or did he handwrite and then send it to a printer? He did handwrite. I know this because throughout this, occasionally, they will give us the actual, like an image of the handwritten version, which is pretty cool. Like here, crucifix and a death hand. And to be quite honest, sometimes Sometimes it's just about, me writing in my tiny notebook, and then, I'm out of space for the line. So, depends. This is not the right poem. We're in the Swan. I'm still very tired. There's a lot going on in life. Called a lot of friends yesterday. Trying to think what I want to say about this poem. This last part. And I heard the people coming with their picnic bags and laughter. And I felt guilty for the swan, as if death were a thing of shame. And like a fool, I walked away and left them my beautiful swan. And this makes me ask, he says like a fool. He was a fool to walk away, to leave his swan, his beautiful swan, the dead swan, right? And why is he a fool for doing this? I guess this makes me ask. I am not quite sure. But he does say before, and I heard the people coming with their picnic bags and laughter. And I felt guilty for the swan, as if death were a thing of shame. So, people coming with their picnic bags and laughter, and I felt guilty for the swan. And I'm fairly confident that this guilt has something to do with these people and their laughter. And probably it feels that since these people are coming to this park or this pond or whatever with this air of levity and joy, that perhaps this swan is going to... Nerdarine, welcome, and welcome raiders. Thank you so much for the raid. How was your stream? What were you working on? King Poyo, welcome in. Hello, Nerdarine. Sup, nerds? As Brian says. Welcome, glad to have you. We are currently just jumping into reading The Swan by Charles Bukowski and doing some analysis here. Cypher Robinson, thank you for the follow and welcome into you as well. Working on the outline for your book. That is awesome. I hope you got as much done as you hoped to, and if not, I hope at very least it was sort of joyful and creative and fun, right? I'll be back on stream in an hour or two, but meanwhile I figured I would share the love. Well, thank you, and I'm glad to have you raid over, and I hope your next stream goes well too. If you do need to take a break, if you need to take care of yourself, definitely do take some time, raid and run, all those things if you need. Thank you, of course. So here is the swan again, and I'm going to gotta get groceries, do that. I'm going to read this poem again just because we have some new people coming in, and we were talking about why death might be a thing of shame in this poem. So here's the Swan by Charles Bukowski. Swans die in the spring too, and there it floated, dead, on a Sunday, sideways, circling in current, and I walked to the rotunda, and overhead gods in chariots, dogs, women, circled, and death ran down my throat like a mouse. And I heard the people coming with their picnic bags and laughter, and I felt guilty for the swan. As if death were a thing of shame, and like a fool, I walked away and left them my beautiful swan. So, we're just talking about how perhaps the guilt for the swan and the shame in death is due to, I would say, the juxtaposition. And that word just means the placing of two things next to each other. The juxtaposition of the levity, the joy that people might be having here, coming to, have a picnic, laugh, enjoy their day, and then have a dead swan there, right? The juxtaposition of death, and particularly the death of something quite beautiful that we'd hope to see alive, and that alongside what should be a joyful and happy, outing for people, right? And I don't think this is the only juxtaposition in this poem, because if we go back to the beginning, swans die in the spring too, right? This is the same feeling, I would say, where swans die in the spring. You have the spring, something beautiful, a time of life, a time of joy and growth, yet swans still die. You have people coming with joy and laughter, yet the swan is dead. Even this line here, dead on a Sunday, Sunday for a reason, right? If I would say any word that you see in a poem, assume that's intentional. And why would he choose Sunday? Well, Sunday is, at least for Christians, right? And he's an American writer, context. A day that is church and some amount of community and life, perhaps. And yet, the swan has decided to die today. I mean, it probably didn't decide to die, but Sideways, circling in a current, and I walked to the rotunda, and overhead, gods in chariots, dogs, women circled, and death ran down my throat like a mouse. I think even here, the idea of the gods in chariots above is perhaps another one of these juxtapositions. Up there, down here. And that, there is beauty, there is life, there is perhaps, that divinity, that power, and then here we just have dead swans. Lots of circlings. Circling indeed, yes. You have circling in the current, the rotunda, the people circle, and then, particularly in that section, and I think that's another useful observation, and I think there is some meaning there. And I have a few thoughts. One, perhaps, so you have the dead swan circling, and you also have the dogs and the women circling. And maybe the gods and chariots, and overhead gods and chariots, dogs, women, circled. It could be that all of those are circling, or that overhead there are gods and chariots, separated, dogs and women circled. But regardless, I think that's fairly important. The idea that both of these sort of things, the dead swan as well as the people, are circling. Bukowski tends to have a bit of a disdain for, the modern person living in consumer society, which perhaps is to say they're in some way dead, like the swan, maybe. Everybody is circling IMO with equal agencies, for the chariot and the swan. Yeah, I do think that's fair. You say equal agencies. Do you mean to say that sort of the swan is circling and it's not in its control, but so are the chariots and the gods and the people and the dogs? If so, yeah, and I think that does make sense. That if we go back to swans die, yeah, nobody has agency. Swans die in the spring too. It doesn't matter the time. It doesn't matter when. Sometimes death just comes, and then you are dead. It's funny because I sort of said earlier that the swan chose to die in the spring, but it didn't, right? Death comes basically just whenever it wants. If we were to sort of characterize it, when ever. I'm bad at writing. What is the legend of the swan song? Like, they sing a beautiful song when they die, but is that true if they die prematurely? That's a very interesting connection with the swan. Of course, the swan, right? This is where symbols become useful in analysis, because yes, the swan song. The swan has many, connections. First of all, I think the swan, very much something of grace and beauty. And the swan also has this idea of the swan song. And perhaps we may ask, did it sing its swan song? I do think that there isn't much reference to anything about song or sound in this poem. You do have death running down Bukowski's throat, perhaps to say sort of choking him, stopping him from speaking, and that almost feels like it could hint toward this idea of the swan song. But it is an interesting observation and connection, and I do think it is important whenever we're looking at a poem. You don't have to, but if you have a symbol like a swan, you're like, oh yeah, there's like that legend of the swan song, absolutely entertain that, look through and say, is there any way we can connect this to what is happening here in the poem? Even if it feels like a reach, because it might give us new insight. You do have the people laughing, their own sort of song. But it doesn't feel like, to me at least, there's quite enough to say that maybe that was in Bukowski's mind as he was writing, right? But big things here in this poem that maybe we want to look at, for like thematically or metaphorically, are the circles. And we've been talking a lot. I feel like almost every time I read a poem lately on stream, we talk about circles and cycles, and it's very much implied in a lot of this section. And then we also have this idea of guilt, of shame, which we ideally would like to unpack. And then the feeling of the fool, the walking away, and maybe where the poem goes from there and what happens. Before I jump into those things, I am going to take a little self-care ad break. That would make sense considering we're reading the same poet. They tend to return ideas they keep having in their head. Yeah, it's funny though, because I feel that the circles I talked about in Drowning Devil's poem and maybe one of Pinguino Man's poems. And perhaps that means that you're watching the same streamer every time, and she likes to think about life in cyclical patterns and the way it goes round and round and round forever. So maybe that's the through line. But I'm going to run this ad. Please don't watch it. I'm going to go to the bathroom, take care of myself. Hello, and welcome back. My name is Ginny, also known as 2/3 Lotus, and we are reading Bukowski. Okay, some things from Stylish Fail. Okay, I have a question that is probably hopeless, but I'm trying to find a poem I read once. Now, I don't know the author or the title, but not very old, I think, about not being a fragile thing, but getting up with broken teeth for another beating. I spent hours yesterday trying to find it. I don't recognize a poem like that, admittedly, but maybe someone here knows. Definitely ask in the Discord. I might be able to locate it for you. Let's get back to this. And I think since we were most recently talking about the circles and the rotunda and the gods, that is what we will dig into first. So, circling in current. Dead on Sunday, sideways circling in current. And I walked to the rotunda, and overhead, gods and chariots, dogs, women, circled. And death ran down my throat like a mouse. So, let me get a color. Stylish Fail, you mentioned the lack of agency that they find in their circling. Agency is one of my favorite words, easily. Mostly because it means a lot to me from like a philosophical, moral perspective. So, but yes. So the swan, of course, lacks agency. It is dead. it is going around in circles in the current forever. Yet, Bukowski places next to that those who are alive, those who are even more than alive, perhaps, those being gods, and then in their chariots, and then dogs and women. Right? A few things with gods and chariots. If we're talking, I believe, Greek myth, the sun is pulled by is like a chariot being pulled across the sky, down in the moon, if I recall correctly. So not only might it be talking about literal gods and, like, divine beings, but it could also just be talking about celestial bodies and the way that life moves forward, right? Life moves forward, sort of without us being in control. And then in the case of the dogs, the women circling the swan itself, probably. They are, first of all, the idea of walking in a circle, of course, lacks agency. You just keep coming back to the same point. Always. And we often feel like we have agency. Let's say these women probably feel like they're looking at the swan out of their own volition. The dogs, I don't know, but they're looking at a dead animal and circling it, not very, sort of just an instinctual thing. And this perhaps, at least with the women circling, might speak to a sort of morbid curiosity. Or it's not really in one's control. There's just this interest in, in this case, staring at a dead swan, circling, watching, not within one's control. Not really sure what this means from a broader perspective yet, but looking at some of the other parts of the poem might help us. And death ran down my throat like a mouse, and I heard the people coming, with their picnic bags and laughter, and I felt guilty for the swan, as if death were a thing of shame. So, presumably these people will come, and just like, the women mentioned up here, they will probably circle, they will probably stare at the swan, because it is an unusual thing to see a dead swan floating in the pond. And so these people will come with their morbid curiosity, and they will look at this dead animal, this thing of once beauty, and use it to satisfy a sort of obsession that is out of their control. Right? And so it does make sense. You would feel this sort of guilt for the swan, because the swan is not only stepping in and perhaps interfering with, like we said earlier, the levity, the joy of the people and their picnic, but also the swan is becoming this object, and no longer necessarily that beautiful bird that it once was. Even says, "My beautiful swan," right? Even though it is dead, even in death, Bukowski sees the swan as beautiful. And yet, others will likely be enwrapped by more the fact that it is no longer, by the fact that it is dead. As if death were a thing of shame. I felt guilty for the swan, as if death were a thing of shame. First of all, this says that Bukowski does not believe death is a thing of shame, right? As if it were a thing of shame. And I think that's just reiterating the guilt earlier for this swan, the shame in this dead thing that is ruining this spring day for some people, perhaps. And like a fool, I walked away and left them, my beautiful swan. So left them, I think, he could just say, and left my beautiful swan, right? Left it behind, left it there. But he says, I walked away and left them, my beautiful swan. I left to them, my beautiful swan. I gave it over to them, right? He has this sense of ownership, my swan. And once he leaves, he probably feels as though he is giving it to these people who are going to make it a thing of shame, right? He's going to turn it over. Turn it over to these people and their picnics and their laughter and their dogs and all of that. What was once his beautiful swan to then be sort of perverted by the morbid curiosity of the people. But that doesn't answer to me, like, maybe I still feel a sort of disconnect between the idea of death here and the shame and Bukowski leaving and the circles and the lack of agency and like this inevitability of death. Maybe this poem is more to say, or maybe not more to say, but in addition to saying that death is going to come, death is inevitable, that alongside the coming of death is the shame and the guilt and the foolishness in action that all surrounds death. Because I think if he's talking about the inevitability of death through this swan, and then also saying that because of the swan, certain patterns, certain actions, certain emotions are sort of prompted, elicited, then perhaps in that perpetuity of death, there is always these feelings that are given rise to. And in that sense, he says that perhaps no matter what, as beautiful things die throughout any point, these beautiful things always die, people die every day, swans die every day, other birds die every day. As that always happens, no matter the day, people are going to react in this sort of, less than ideal, less than poetic way, where Bukowski would prefer to see this swan as still beautiful. Bukowski perhaps looks at the dead and sees the life, right? Whereas those with life and their picnic bags and their lovely pleasant Sunday afternoons see this swan, and instead of, like Bukowski, seeing the beauty of life, have the life that they feel they have in that day, and have it sort of taken away by the swan. And this maybe makes sense that Bukowski would feel this way, because Bukowski isn't exactly living like the most vibrant life. He drinks, he writes poetry, he's poor, his life kind of sucks. It's not the most vibrant. He's not going out on Sunday afternoons with his atomic family and the picnic basket and the 2 children and all of this. So, in his life that isn't so divorced from death, and his life that isn't so focused on having the perfect afternoon and the perfect life, he is maybe more able to see, when he sees death, the beauty and the life in that. Whereas the people who live their perfect, manicured, like white picket fence lives, these people are going to be less able to see the beauty in death, fundamentally because they are more divorced from it, and they see their beautiful life, and any little bit of death is more of an infringement upon it, as opposed to a reminder of life. Bukowski also says in the middle of this poem, "And death ran down my throat like a mouse." So Bukowski does notice the death. He does feel it. It is very much inside of him, literally, as he describes, literally with a metaphor. And yet he still finds beauty. Where these people are up overhead, away, looking from afar, on the rotunda, in the sky, distant, and interestingly enough, that distance from death creates more fear of death, where the proximity to death is what allows him to see the beauty. Penguino Man, what up, my wonderful bonitas? Welcome, Penguino Man. How are you? We're doing some Bukowski right now. We're reading The Swan, and it's about death, maybe, and the distance that we place between death and life, so far as I interpret, and all of that. Yeah, you could tell. Figured. So, I've maybe come to this interpretation for the poem. And something that's good to do, if you have the energy, is if I say this poem is about the distance that we place between ourselves and death, and how that affects our relationship with it, well then one thing you can do is go back through the entire poem and say, does each line relate to this? Does the whole poem feel like it speaks to what I'm saying? So the swan, in its grace and beauty, is dead. Swans die in the spring, too. Even amongst beauty there is death. And there it floated dead on a Sunday, sideways. I really like sideways here. It feels very, like, graphic in a way. It's such a plain way to show how dead the swan is. Like, of course the swan is dead, but to say that it is sideways, right? Swans are these tall, elegant, beautiful things, and it's sideways. Like, it's such a perfect way to describe it. I just wanted to say that. Very graphic in a way, or very visual. Circling in current. Going around the perpetuity, the lack of agency, in death. It is simply going along with death. And I walked the rotunda, and overhead, far away, distanced from death, gods and chariots, dogs, women, circled. And death ran down my throat like a mouse. So Bukowski finds himself not distanced from death, in being close, in watching, in trying to understand the swan. It comes right down his throat, and he feels death. He understands it in a way that those further away do not. And I heard the people coming, not here yet, far away, with their picnic bags and laughter. And I felt guilty for the swan, as if death were a thing of shame, because once they get here, the death is going to grab them, and it's going to probably mess up their beautiful picnic day because of their distance, like we said here. And like a fool, I walked away and left them, my beautiful swan. And I think Bukowski might just be a fool, because, first of all, just because he's walking away from beauty. And I think anyone who's spent a good amount of time outside and observing beauty, you know, if you're writing or just being outside and like enjoying it, you might have had this experience where you are looking at something so beautiful, an animal, a tree, a dead swan circling in a pond if you're Bukowski, because you're freaking Bukowski, and you look at this thing and then you find that you're sort of done looking at it. Perhaps you hear other people, perhaps there's a distraction, and you move on. And I think very often we move on, and I find that when I do this, I feel it to be a very foolish thing. It's like, oh, I was looking at this beautiful tree, this beautiful mountain, this beautiful scene, this beautiful animal, and then I leave. And it's always like the worst decision ever, because I think sometimes in these moments of, I think, very like supreme beauty, and Bukowski definitely is feeling some amount of high-level beauty in this situation, because he does talk about divinity in this poem, of course not directly related to the beauty, but I think if we're bringing up things like divinity, strong emotion like guilt and shame, and beauty and death, these are big themes, and often that means that the beauty that he is feeling is probably quite great. So when you walk away from a beauty like this and go back to your day, and in this case he's probably going back to like Los Angeles city streets, it kind of sucks and you feel like a fool. I think there is then another layer of why Bukowski would feel like a fool, because as he says, he left them, the swan. Without him there, without him watching the swan, you know, there's no one appreciating its beauty anymore. He leaves it to these people who are going to see it as a terrible, dead thing, a thing to ruin the day, a sad thing. And he is foolish, perhaps, and again, guilty for the swan, because he leaves, and with him, the appreciation of the beauty of the swan itself, also leaves. I think, Stylish Fail, earlier you mentioned the swan song, and it is not so far off the idea of that from this poem, now that we've dug into it. Not necessarily relating to any specific words in here, but as you said, the legend of the swan song. That before it dies, it sings the most beautiful song, and then it kicks it, right? And in this case, Bukowski is seeing this final amount of beauty in the swan. He is noticing, he is hearing the swan song, perhaps just by his presence here watching the swan, right? In a sense, Bukowski, in his observation, is this swan song. And then he leaves, right? And the song has ended. And the swan is now a carcass and a dead thing and something that the people are going to, look at with their morbid curiosity. Oh, cool connection. Yeah, I think I wanted to bring it back to the swan song. And I do feel like, even if Bukowski is not thinking this in the poem, it does feel as though he is this swan song, that beautiful thing. And like you said, it may not have had a chance to sing that song, but maybe, to take the symbol of the swan, that legend does live on through this poem. It's been busy and tough, slept for 12 hours on the other hand, so not entirely sure. That is good, right? You probably need to rest then. It would be, wait. I guess THA? That. No, now I'm confused. Which then would it be? You probably needed rest then. It's gotta be that then, right? I think it's that one, like EN. Wait. Ugh. It's like messing with me to see that. Then. No, then is time. Right. Can we... Maybe one of y'all needs to write a poem titled, T-H-A... How would I, titled Then, with the A-E. There's probably some wisdom there. Yeah, and Penguin, hopefully you do feel better. Feeling better tends to be a good thing. We try. So, I feel like that's my thoughts on this poem. These ones tend to be... Oh, I should critique this, maybe. I always say to critique everything. You all know this. If you've been here for... more than 2 hours, I probably say it in that span, to critique everything. So what do I think Charles Bukowski, legendary American poet, can do better in this poem? But it's always hard, because he does a really good job at writing poems, I think. That's why he's famous. A little bit. Also because he's got this caricature, and he was this media presence with his interviews and whatnot. Swans die in the spring, too. And there it floated, dead on a Sunday, sideways, circling in current. And I walked to the rotunda, and overhead, gods and chariots, dogs, women, circled. And death ran down my throat like a mouse, and I heard the people coming with their picnic bags and laughter, and I felt guilty for the swan, as if death were a thing of shame. And like a fool, I walked away and left them my beautiful swan. So I think particularly the middle section is very like efficient in its verbiage. This circling in the current, and I walked to the rotunda, and overhead gods and chariots, dogs, women circled, and death ran down my throat like a mouse. Like, he says so much in 8 lines, and Bukowski, I think, always does this really well. I notice this the more I read him, is he is so excellent at not wasting his words, and it makes it really hard to give criticism to this dead poet, because the easiest way to critique, I would say, is to advise people to remove things, right? This is, I would say, pretty fundamental, you'll find, as you start critiquing people's work. Telling people to add things is a very dangerous thing to do to their poem, or suggesting they add things, because you can't be certain of their ideas. I can go through an hour of interpretation, and I think this is what it is. And I could say, oh, add this line, because I think it would work with your theme, but I can't be sure. So, like, saying, well, maybe we add this is always dangerous, but shortening a poem, making it more efficient, making it more emotionally to the point is good. And again, the amount of vividness he uses to describe these people in a short time. Heard the people coming, describes the distance. With their picnic bags, shows that they're sort of these like regular people trying to have this nice afternoon, and their laughter, they're joyous right now. That's all of them. And I feel guilty for the swan, as if death is a thing of shame. So now, without even saying it, he says that the swan is going to ruin this day. Which, like, there's so much in between the lines that Bukowski does, which I really appreciate. And like I said earlier, when he describes the swan as just sideways, I don't think there is a more to-the-point word that could describe a dead swan in their vertical elegance. Blech. It's dead, right? It's so good. But I do think, like, it's hard. It's really hard to critique Bukowski, and that's how it should be. I think if you find a poet who is like widely and critically considered great, and you find it really easy to critique their work, maybe you should be questioning why people find them so great. Not that a critiquable poem is a bad poem, but an uncritiquable poem is certainly pretty good, at least. And like a fool, I walked away and left them my beautiful swan. I do wonder if Bukowski could indicate some amount of circularity in his own walking away, but again, that would be like something I would add to this poem. The feeling that he is also part of a broader one of these circles, these cycles, these patterns that he is not sort of in control of. But part of Bukowski's work is his crippling lack of self-awareness, so I think if he did include it, it would feel very not Bukowski. Leaving that out, feels right. Swans die in the spring too, and there it floated dead on a Sunday. Like, that gives information on the scene, how the day is. It's beautiful, it's nice, it's calm, it's a weekend. It's a day that's generally like religiously associated with life and also rest, right? And so much information that Bukowski can communicate, often through symbol, often through metaphor, or just simple adjectives in very, 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 very short time. But Maybe chat. Any of you can help me. Do any of you have things you don't like about this poem? Any things you would change? Because I am the internet's #1 Bukowski simp, and that, like, I really genuinely like his writing a lot, and it might just be that I've spent so much time with it. But do any of y'all have gripes, irksome things that you notice, just generally things you don't think are good writing in this poem, The Swan? If so, please do share. I would always rather hear someone in chat say, I don't like this, and tell me why, than say, like, I enjoy this poem. Of course, if you like it, you can say that too. You can say the parts you like. But, you know, most of the time, I do plenty of saying that I like poems on here. Drink some water. Nothing? Not very critical today in chat. Okay. Well. No, it's a good poem. Okay. It is a good poem. Like, he's really good at poetry. And it's hard to critique. It's especially hard to critique after you feel you have a solid interpretation that feels like it brings the whole poem together. I can't say nothing about Daddy Bukow. Yes. So, you know, words good. Good job, Charlie. Yep, Charles. Thank you for the poem. Maybe, so, the last poem we read was, like, about life being entirely not beautiful from his third floor window. And then before that he was talking about dead animals. And of course this order is dictated by the editor of this book, Abel de Brito. And I really, really enjoy the way it goes back and forth between Bukowski saying, like, life is not beautiful, you must, you know, put poetry and beauty into life, and then, you know, jumping back to a poem that is entirely beautiful, and then, you know, before that there was a poem about death being more of a not positive thing. And I just think the organization of this book always feels like we're reading something fresh and, like, unfamiliar from Bukowski and learning new things about his work. So I still love Abel de Brito's collection here, and I am still going to email him once I get through it someday. I'm going to read this one more time, and then we'll call it here, and then go do something else. The Swan by Charles Bukowski. Swans die in the spring too, and there it floated, dead on a Sunday, sideways, circling in current, and I walked to the rotunda, and overhead, gods and chariots, dogs, women circled, and death ran down my throat like a mouse. And I heard the people coming with their picnic bags and laughter, and I felt guilty for the swan, as if death were a thing of shame. And like a fool, I walked away and left them my beautiful swan. The Swan by Charles Bukowski. The swan that is sideways. Good job, Mr. Drunk Man. Good job indeed. I like this poetry so much. I think it's probably good to read things I really like, that I just, you know, sort of can't complain about when life kind of sucks. It's really nice to read, like, just freaking incredible poetry. Thanks for listening to me and my thoughts on Bukowski. Make sure to check out the rest of the series if you enjoyed, and follow or stop by Twitch if you want to see more. See you there.